Good afternoon, everybody. This is truly, thank you. This is truly one of the biggest crowds we've seen here in a long time. We're at probably close to capacity, so let's hopefully, if we have to spill out a little bit, we will, but we'll keep an eye on it. But I want to thank you all for coming here today. Feels like night with the rain out there, to listen to our congressman, a guy who I guess say that over 20 years we could be old friends now, I guess. And we've always gotten along really well. And I want to also salute you and your office. And Jimmy, where did Jimmy go? Jimmy, thank you. The most responsive guy in Connecticut. Thank you so much. When you reach out to me, when people reach out for issues on the federal level, especially passports, it's in seconds. Jimmy gets back to me, and it's almost always taken care of. So I thank the Congressman, Jimmy, and everybody there. But I want to turn it over to Congressman Jim Himes now. And again, Jim, thank you for coming home.
Thank you. Thanks, Fred. Thank you, Fred, and thanks, Fred, for your leadership here in the town of Greenwich. It is home for me, so I pay particular close attention to local politics in Greenwich. I just did a town hall in Trumbull, and on the way down from Trumbull, lots of traffic, and a text from the governor who said, "Can I crash your town hall?" And you don't say no to the governor, especially when he is also a resident of the town of Greenwich when he's not in Hartford, and a very good and old friend. So I'm just, Governor, I'm delighted you're here. He's not doing Q&A. I'm doing the Q&A, just so you know. He'll do a different one. But, Governor, we're really, really honored to have you here, so I'll just give you the floor for a couple minutes.
All right. Yeah, Jim, thanks for letting Andy and I crash your party. We live right nearby. And it's really fun for us being home. We've been in this room for so many years that I was here when the podium was over there. We looked out this direction for the BET, and then the Board of Selectmen with John Margonot many years ago. And I think most of you are here because it's a little scary times out there right now. You look around the world. You look at the attack on Israel. You look at Ukraine potentially running out of bullets at some point towards the end of this year. You look at dangers in the South China Sea. You look at Republican leadership in the House of Representatives. Looks a little chaotic. Well, thank God you got steady leadership right here in Jim Himes. And I got to tell you, as your governor, it's really helpful to be part of a team. And we've got a great congressional delegation. We've got good leadership, folks coming up from Greenwich, up in the legislature. I think I saw Hector here somewhere, and Rachel perhaps, and I don't know who else. That's how we get things done. I'll just say on a personal note, what's really important is getting a little bit of certainty in life. And right now, this is a very uncertain time. Jim can tell you about what's going on in the world. I can tell you just in 3 minutes what's going on in Connecticut. But going back 5, 6, 7 years, Connecticut was a little bit chaotic. Connecticut was going from boom to bust to boom to bust. And people weren't quite sure what the next day would bring. A lot of companies were leaving. Taxes were going up. And we had a budget, a little like what's going on in Washington, D.C. right now, where you weren't sure when the budget was going to be passed. It was passed 6 months late. And for a lot of our towns, a little less Greenwich because you depend less on the state than some of our municipalities do, it was a very scary time. And amidst all this, chaos out there, I'd like to think that state of Connecticut is not exactly a sea of tranquility, but we've steadied the ship. We studied the ship in the sense that, we have had 5 balanced budgets in a row. We studied the ship in the sense that we got through COVID. I think we got through COVID better than most other states. We did it because we hung together. We looked out for each other. We cared for each other. I think a lot of people took notice of, the values that make Connecticut unique. For the first time in decades, we have tens of thousands of families that want to move into the state of Connecticut, and that's a good thing. Good thing. A lot of guys my age. It's nice getting some younger folks here, and what that means in terms of growth and opportunity for everybody. And I still look around this country, and I look with some nerves. I mean, the same way I try and give certainty to our mayors, I give certainty to their folks in the not-for-profit, give our teachers, give our firemen, give our cops some confidence that where we're going to be a year or three from now, why they want to be here, why they want to continue to do the jobs they do so amazingly. So that incredible uncertainty you see coming out of Washington around the world is a little bit scary. And but that's why we've got guys like Jim Himes here, and it's my job to introduce him and tell you he's a great friend, a really steady presence down there, and a great ally for the great state of Connecticut. Thanks, Jim.
Ned, thank you. Thank you for that. We've really. One of the points of these meetings, we've got lots of different views in the room. That's great. It's one of the strengths of our country. And Ned, people will agree, disagree with your policies, but anybody who is in a position of elected authority, when we went through arguably the most brutal thing that in our lifetimes we remember, that is a pandemic that killed over 1 million Americans, hats off for your remarkable leadership and to the remarkable leadership of all who did that. Okay, thank you all for coming. I'm just grateful for your presence. As I said, I just did a wonderful town hall up in Trumbull, Connecticut, and I'm just so delighted that we can get back to these conversations that were suspended during the COVID era. And this is your time. It's your issues. My plan is to speak for 8, 9, 10 minutes about just a couple of high points, looking back over these last 2 years or so, and then to talk about whatever you'd like to talk about. So I'll keep my opening remarks to under 10 minutes. Just 2 ground rules, please. The first is the way we'll do Q&A is there's going to be a microphone over there. Gloria DePina is raising her hand, and just line up at the microphone if you'd like to speak. And I would just ask that it's important to us to hear from everybody. And so at about 2 minutes of a comment or a question or whatever, you'll get a gentle and polite reminder from Gloria that you're at 2 minutes, and that's not to pick on you. It's just to make sure that anybody who wants to ask a question or make a statement can do so. The second thing I would ask, it's in my job description to absorb whatever it is that you want to say, questions, anger, happiness, whatever it is, that's my job. But I would ask you somewhat adamantly to please be respectful of the opinions of others who have chosen to come here today. So if somebody says something you don't agree with, stand up and explain why. Let's not have booing and hissing and that's right on either side. Again, we did a wonderful job in Trumbull with that. So I would just ask you, again, if you disagree with something you hear, stand up and let's have that conversation in a way that is consistent with the values of Connecticut and of Greenwich. So thank you for that. So many friends and others, townspeople, great to see you, and thank you for being here. Okay, right up front. First of all, let me start. We all woke up this morning to just a brutal, violent attack on the state of Israel out of Gaza. Led by Hamas and who knows who else, and it would be inappropriate for me to start anywhere other than to say that we do not accept that kind of violence, and we will stand with our ally, the State of Israel, in this very, very difficult moment. This is sadly a moment where we're seeing too much of that kind of violence in the Middle East and, of course, in Ukraine, which we'll talk more about if you would like to. I serve in a place that is, Ned made reference to this, particularly dysfunctional right now, and I'm not here to talk politics, although I will be clear, I'm here under my official federal rubric, so if you're expecting, Democratic Party rally or whatever it is, I am here under my official rubric, but happy to answer questions of any variety. But I do want to start with a couple of points in this moment of dysfunctionality. 4 or 5 bills that were passed in the last couple of years that I think are going to have an impact on the American people. I'll do it very quickly because this is a moment where we crave functionality and we also crave bipartisanship. And thank you, Fred, for starting us off with that tone. 4 bills that were bipartisan that I think are important, I will cover very, very quickly. Number 1, and I start here quite deliberately, we passed the PACT Act in bipartisan fashion in the Congress. It is now law. Our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who were exposed to burn pits and other toxicities that beset our military bases and other places abroad, they now have a presumption that respiratory cancers and the many, many illnesses that they contract when they come back from serving us in very dangerous places, there's now a presumption that those diseases are caused by their service and by their exposure, and consequently our veterans, big bipartisan step to making sure that our veterans get the care that they need from the VA, and I just deliberately start there because that's really so important. important to all of us, and they said it couldn't be done. For the first time in 30 years, in bipartisan fashion, we passed some gun safety relevant legislation. And it threaded the needle of the very aggressive argument that we have on this topic, which means so much to those of us who live in proximity of Sandy Hook. And that bill, again, bipartisan, it tightened up the mechanisms by which somebody under the age of 21 can purchase a weapon. It gave our police more resources to do what we call in the state of Connecticut, execute risk warrants. That is to say, if somebody's been determined to be a danger to themselves or to others, to temporarily remove their weapons, consistent with the law and the Second Amendment. And it also contained very substantial resources for something that is important to everybody in this room, which is mental health. We tend to forget we tend to forget in the gun debate, and it makes me sad that this is true. Of course, the horror is what captures the headline. So every time somebody goes into a school or a mall with an assault weapon and murders people, that is, of course, what captures the headlines. But never forget that 2/3 of gun violence and gun fatalities in this country are caused by suicide. And so things like safe storage and other mental health issues are really important to that argument. Bill number 2 that was bipartisan. CHIPS Act, I won't spend a lot of time on it, but bipartisan bill because we realized during the pandemic that supply chains really matter. When the greatest country, most powerful country, richest country in the world can't get enough masks, enough stuff to manage a pandemic, you realize that supply chains matter. The CHIPS Act is making a very substantial investment in moving back what people call the oil of the 21st century. That is to say, semiconductors, chips, the things that run everything, that make sure that a lot of those supply chains are here in the U.S. or with our allies. That is good for our security and prosperity. It's also good because CHIPS Act doesn't usually get applause, but thank you. It's also get into 12 nanometer lithography. But it's also good because, you know, there are chips plant. Google's building $1 billion chips plant in Ohio. I'm glad, I'd love to have them build it here, but I'm happy they're building it in Ohio. And that's going to mean a lot of jobs and a lot of technological know-how. Bill number 3, strong bipartisan, good stuff, investment in research and development. Our long-term competitive advantage in this world is our innovative capacity. The fact that if it's technological and it's cutting edge, we tend to develop it in this country. Fourth, and arguably day-to-day most important for us, bipartisan. We passed the bipartisan infrastructure law, $550 billion investment in our infrastructure, which gets boring quickly, but for the fact that we live every single day with the problems on 95, on the Merit, which I just spent an hour on, you know, our trains, and not just traditional infrastructure, but making sure, as we learned during the pandemic, that every American family should have access to broadband, Wi-Fi, that sort of thing. It's going to be celebratable over a period of time, but you see those signs, you sit in traffic, you see the construction, you know, obviously we're going to put up with some near-term disruption. Here in Greenwich, what is it doing for Greenwich? We're actually finally, after 2 generations, and I'm looking for Fred Camillo because he absorbs a lot of pain on this one, the Byram River has been flooding forever, creating all sorts of hassle in that neighborhood. In the next 2 or 3 years, we're going to rebuild the bridge across the Post Road in such a way that there's a lot less flooding in Byram. That's just one example of something that will happen here in the town of Greenwich. One bill I'm going to mention, and then I'm going to move on, that sadly wasn't bipartisan and is, like everything else, subject to debate, was what was inaptly called the Inflation Reduction Act. A grab bag of measures that I supported, but that were, I say inaptly named because it wasn't necessarily about reducing inflation. This room understands that reducing inflation is partly about spending, but it's also very much in the hands of the monetary policy authorities, the Federal Reserve. So anyway, whether it should have been named that or not, it contained the very largest investment we have ever made in addressing climate change. And it was, I'm sure we'll talk more about that. It was tax credits. It was investment in reordering our grid so that it can handle the kind of electricity that we're going to need to have available when everybody is charging a car rather than filling a car, and you know, all sorts of measures designed to address that problem. Good step in the right direction, not adequate. We still have work to do on that issue. The other thing I would highlight out of that bill, and again, I supported it, you deserve to know where I stand. And I feel very good about this. For the first time, Medicare will be allowed to negotiate the cost of prescription drugs with the pharmaceutical companies. 10 drugs will be negotiating starting in the year 2026, and then we'll go on. Additional drugs will be added in the years to follow. Medicare out-of-pocket expenditures for those people on Medicare were capped. Cash out-of-pocket expenditures were capped at $2,000 per year, and any Medicare recipients using insulin, the cost of insulin will be capped at $35 a month. That is, in my opinion, good stuff. And by the way, subject to debate. And what I mean by that is that, and I have a very important pharmaceutical company in my district, Boehringer Ingelheim in Ridgefield, Connecticut. They make the argument that if we do, and it is, by the way, what Germany, the UK, Japan, and all industrialized countries do, which is we use our buying power through Medicare to negotiate discounts. Their argument is that that means less cash flow for them, less investment in R&D. I think that argument may be true to a point, but not to a point where I want to do a lot more town hall meetings where inevitably I hear somebody say, I can't afford my prescriptions. So I'll leave that one there. And just close with a couple of items that I hope we will focus on. I talked about climate change. We still have work to do. It is a challenge because we do need to migrate to non-carbon sources of energy. We need to do it in a way that doesn't devastate families that are either reliant on coal mining in West Virginia, and I'm irritating some people in saying this, that doesn't devastate the state of Wyoming, and that doesn't make people who are barely making ends meet not be able to afford to heat their homes in the summer. That's the challenge. That's the challenge. And it's a hard one. And we can talk more about energy and climate change, but we have more to do. That's a big deal. Border security and immigration. We have a lot of work to do in that area. And let me just be very clear about this. We need to do a much better job securing our border. A nation needs to have secure borders, and I'm not at all apologetic about saying that. I spend a lot of time in the Intelligence Committee looking at possible threats that can come through porous borders. I will also say that almost everybody coming through the borders is here looking for economic advancement, and we must never dehumanize the people that are doing that. An awful lot of our forebears did that. And again, I'm not going to get in, unless you want to talk about it, I'm not going to get deep into this, but we need to focus on the border. We also need to do, in my opinion, a lot more legal immigration. More legal immigration means that it helps solve our social security challenges. It means, by the way, look at the folks that are running I referred earlier to innovative companies. Look at the folks that are running our innovative companies in this country. They tend to be immigrants. And I won't spend a lot of time on that, but immigrants are in many ways the vibrancy of our economy. So, lastly, we may have a bunch of conversations about aid to Ukraine and Taiwan. Aid to Ukraine, again, you deserve to know where I stand. I have been very aggressive in saying that we should support Ukraine. In my lifetime, there haven't been a lot of conflicts that were morally clear. I was born during the Vietnam War. We all lived through Afghanistan, Iraq. These are, for all the reasons we understand, morally ambiguous moments. When you have a murderous dictator like Vladimir Putin brutally invade a country, undertake, genocidal cleansing of towns like Bucha, the moral case is clear. If dictators see that they can achieve their aims through the brutal invasion of other countries, that has reverberations to Iran, to North Korea, and of course to President Xi in China. So we learned in the 20th century that if we just say that's somebody else's problem, eventually it becomes our problem in a very big way. I'll just close on the question of Taiwan. I've spent a lot of time, and I probably understand as well as anybody the nature of the threat, sitting as I do on the Intelligence Committee. I am spending a lot of time urging my colleagues to take a deep breath on the issue of China. It's one of these moments where politicians compete to sound hawkish on China. And look, there's good reasons. to criticize China, their human rights record, the fact that they steal our IP, that they manipulated their currency to devastate, the manufacturing hubs of the Midwest. There's lots and lots of reasons to be angry at China, but we also need to remember that we do record trade today with China, about $800 billion worth of trade. And if you just shut that off, the devastation to our economy and to the Chinese economy would be very substantial. They own $1 trillion of our national debt. That's something worth thinking about. And then finally, I mentioned other conflicts. I worry that we've gotten into the habit of thinking of war as something that is happening somewhere else that doesn't have a lot of impact. That is obviously not true for a tiny percentage of Americans whose sons and daughters, husbands and wives are serving. But make no mistake, a military conflict with China looks nothing like what we have just experienced. I happen to be with the commander of Indo-PACOM. This is the combatant command based out of Hawaii that has responsibility for East Asia and China. And Admiral Aquilino said, if we get into a war with China, we win it ultimately, but we start in 10 days by losing 2 aircraft carriers. There's 6,000 people on an aircraft carrier. So I just say that to say, very complicated topic, but it's an area in which we need to be thoughtful, take a deep breath, and make sure we're proceeding with the kind of prudence that we should. Okay, that was a little bit more than 9 minutes. The rest of the time is yours. Again, please, more or less 2 minutes, and send anything you want my way, but let's be respectful of other. Sir, people, Gloria, just point to where you want people lining up, and yeah.
Thank you, Gloria. Congressman, Mike Davis, I live in Norwalk. I was going to go to Trumbull instead of coming down here today, but what happened this morning fascinated me. I was watching TV. You're on the Intelligence Committee. What I heard was that there was a big failure of intelligence on the part of both Israel, but also the U.S. And I'm not asking for any, but can you comment on that?
Yeah, I can comment quickly because I don't know the answer to your question. Needless to say, people have asked me, is it an intelligence failure? I'm not in Washington where I get briefed in classified environments, so I have no more information than you do. I will tell you that the Israeli security services and the Palestinian security services, both of whom we worked very closely with, the Israelis are as good as it gets. They're up there with our NSA and CIA. So I'm a little hesitant to start making conclusive judgments about failure. I will tell you that something this big that was unexpected raises some pretty profound questions. And number one, I will ask those questions on Tuesday when I get back to Washington, particularly with respect to our intelligence, because our intelligence has been superb in Ukraine. And if we missed this and therefore failed to pass on intelligence to the Israelis as an overseer, I will be very, very interested in how that happened. The other comment I want to make is, I said this before, we're going to stand with Israel. We're also going to determine the extent of Iran's involvement in this. And, it's one thing to do low-grade terrorism and, try to get, missiles into Assad's arsenal. To support what was a warlike attack on the state of Israel is a significant escalation by Iran, and there's going to need to be consequences.
Switching gears, I appreciate that. Switching gears, there's dysfunction in Washington, obviously. Right now, there's 2 candidates for Speaker of the House. My question to you is, as bad as McCarthy was, in my opinion, he's a lot better than Jim Jordan, who is a leading candidate. I wouldn't be opposed to Scalise getting in, but why are the Democrats, why didn't they, just a couple of Democrats voting for McCarthy and he would have stayed in power?
Yeah, I get that question a lot, and let me tell you the political story, and I'm going to try to be brief about it because, again, this is not so much about politics, it's about policy. But the Democratic Party stepped in twice in a very substantial way to solve Speaker McCarthy's policy problems. Last Saturday, it feels like a million years ago, but last Saturday, when the government was going to shut down in 9 hours, and we hadn't been consulted in any way, they're the majority, they have the right to do that. At about 11 o'clock, McCarthy's people produced a 71-page continuing resolution, which ultimately passed to keep the government open. We asked him for 90 minutes to read the bill. He said no. As a consequence, we had to do some dilatory stuff on the floor because we had to read those 71 pages. You know, Hakeem Jeffries gave his 45-minute speech while we're madly reading this thing. As we read this thing, we realized it didn't have Ukraine aid in it. And when I realized that, my heart broke for all the reasons that we've talked about. But I voted yes, as did all but one of my Democratic colleagues. The one who didn't vote for it is Mike Quigley. He's got a huge Ukrainian population, so we kind of know where he was on this. Anyway, essentially all of us voted for a bill that we hadn't even heard of an hour and a half earlier. And as a result of that, only half of Kevin's people, the Republicans, voted for it. So as a consequence, we didn't shut down the government. That's exactly what happened in the debt ceiling crisis. The Speaker negotiated with the President, with the Senate. We got a deal. We almost all voted for it, and they booted him from his job for doing that. So we stand with him when it comes to policy. But then the question was, is it our responsibility to bail out Speaker McCarthy when he is being eaten by the lion that he empowered? He did not need to give a one-person motion to vacate to Matt Gaetz, and none of us had any doubt about how this was going to happen. So the last thing I'll say, and again, I don't want to spend a lot of more time on Insider. I'm very tight with two Republican chairmen, and I sent both of them texts saying it's a hard needle to thread, but there are lots of Democrats who would insulate you from what's about to happen. Obviously, we would have a price, you know. I mean, this is a guy who started an impeachment inquiry without a vote, blah, blah, blah. We have our things. There would have been a list of things that we asked for. It's politics. And the interesting thing is, he nor none of his people came and said, let's talk. And it didn't need to be to me. But anyway, it was a missed opportunity. It would have been a very heavy lift to get Democrats to support Kevin McCarthy, but not impossible. So here we are.
Jean-Jacques Gillet from Greenwich. Well, I was in the House when you voted about suspending the debt limit, thanks to your super staff in your office, by the way, in May. Ukraine, how is the way forward to help them? Because they desperately need help. I mean, when you listen to Putin yesterday in Sochi, Ukraine is just the beginning for him. And on the federal budget deficit, the rising yields, are you concerned about the rising federal interest expense? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I'm very concerned about that. We're now spending $417 billion a year on interest alone. $417 billion, that's probably the size of France's budget or something like that. And we're spending it on interest. And, you know, it was pretty easy to run the deficits and increase the debt the way both parties have. When interest rates are zero, they're not zero anymore. So we're going to start feeling the pressure. And I'm going to keep this answer short, and I'm happy to tell you what I've done over the years in support of what I would hope would be fiscal sanity. What I'm going to say on it is, let's have that discussion, but let's have that discussion smart. So our interest, which you just referred to, our Social Security and Medicare and defense spending, those four things make up about 75% of federal spending. So, and I just highlight that to say, this is tough stuff, you know. Waste, fraud, and abuse. There's waste, fraud, and abuse. Whenever somebody tells you that that's the problem, they're not being honest with you. An honest conversation is, what are we going to do about the sustainability, long-term sustainability of Social Security? How do we feel about $800 billion a year to the Pentagon? You know, it's a very dangerous work. Anyway, you see where I'm going here, which is, let's have that conversation, but it really does need to be honest and informed. Ukraine, very quickly. I have been a critic of the Biden administration because I have felt all along that they have given the Ukrainians enough weaponry to fight the Russians to a standstill, but not to win. And it's a morally untenable position in my mind to work to a standstill. Easy for me to say. I'm not making the decisions that are increasing the statistics either way on the possibility of nuclear war. So I'm still going to criticize the Biden administration for not being aggressive enough. I would send them the ATACMS. These are long-range artillery and rockets, and I would accelerate F-16s. But though I disagree with it, I understand the president's caution about how you do this with a nuclear power, an unstable nuclear power. Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Ken Muffson. I live in Stamford. The rhetoric from Trump and the Republicans has gotten to a really frightening level. And a lot of people are talking about concerns about the end of democracy, the beginning of an autocracy that we couldn't even imagine. What are your thoughts about it? I guess I'm looking for some reassurance here that this isn't the end of the country as we know it, but your honest opinion.
Two things. Number one, my beef is not with the Republican Party. Fred Camillo introduced me, and I work very closely with Patrick McHenry. I worked with Patrick McHenry to pass the first ever out-of-committee cryptocurrency regulation. I work with French Hill. I work very closely with Mike Turner of Ohio, who's the chairman of Intelligence. So I want to be clear that my fight is not with the Republican Party. My fight is with the extreme MAGA element that would happily discard constitutional norms. And somebody will say, you know, one of two things. They're not happily, discarding. Yes, they are. I was in the room on January 6th. I don't claim to be an expert on a lot of things, but I am a little bit of an expert on what the instincts were and what fomented the first ever attack on the Capitol of the United States. And it was a belief that the election had gone away, that the lie that it was stolen, and the belief by some very smart people, lawyers who are currently been indicted, that we should not use the traditional method of electing a president, but that we should do false electors, that we should, anyway, you see where I'm going on this. That's where my quarrel is. And candidly, I lack a little credibility on this because I'm in the fight. So the fight is really out there in America, right? And it's a hard conversation to have, but we just need to be very clear with our fellow Americans that we will enjoy and celebrate disagreement, even on the hard topics. This country continues to have a racial conversation, which is about as hard as it gets, and let's have that conversation. What we're not going to do is compromise on attempts to overthrow our democracy, our constitutional order, or frankly to live in a world of indecency, which is also an attribute of some of the MAGA, extreme MAGA movement. The second thing I want to say is my wife, Sarah, we've been married for, 29 years or something, and I learned this. I learned one thing, which is that oftentimes in these conflicts, it's pretty good to start with yourself, right? Like, what can I do? Because I'm not going to change a lot of MAGA minds, honestly. I'm a target. I am sometimes a provoker. The one thing I know, because I've been thinking about this and talking to people about this for a long time, is that there's a distinction to be drawn between folks that are hopeless. They embrace violence or whatever makes them hopeless. They're white nationalists or whatever they are. And people who I saw on January 6th, some people that I saw on January 6th, and I saw these people up close and personal. And there were some very bad people that day. There were also some very good people who had their minds twisted in a terrible way. And, why, right? I talked to Tim Ryan, who ran for Senate and lost in Ohio. And he would say to me, Jimmy, you're from Fairfield County. Your people shower in the morning, before work. My people shower after work, and you have no idea. Now, that's an exaggeration, obviously. In this place, we have blue-collar Americans in Connecticut. But his point is that sometimes on the coast, we don't see the economic devastation. The fact that Youngstown, Ohio, which used to be a vibrant place, is now full of fentanyl dens and stuff. And he said, just be sensitive to what you don't know. So, long-winded way of saying, doctor, heal thyself first. Here's what I mean by that. One thing I know for sure is that we're not going to restitch the civic fabric in this country if you are a MAGA person and I say you're a seditious, evil traitor. That may be emotionally satisfying, but that is just going to continue the tearing of this country in two. Yes, sir.
I got it. Yes, Mike Krause. I live in Stamford. I'm outside of Greenwich. First off, to you and your wife, I know you were dealing with breast cancer. We've had the same in my family. My sister-in-law just celebrated 15 years clean. So very, very important of what you and what you've been doing. So thank you. Secondarily, one of the biggest issues, and you referenced it, has to do with our debt and the debt that this country has. When you came into Congress, I think it was probably somewhere around $10 trillion, give or take. And now we're up to 33, 35, 38, whatever they keep going. And I agree with you to the point of it's not just fraud and abuse. It's evaluating. Both you and I have come out of business, and you have to look at processes, procedures. What do we need? Is there doubling up? How can you in Congress actually work together? The gentleman who was just here our country is now split with how people see. It's the left, it's the right, there's nothing in the middle. How can we fix that? Not just us, but Washington sends that message every day, and depending on whether, you and I have had this discussion before, whether you're watching Newsmax, OEN, Fox or CNN or MSNBC, you're going to get a different skew that continues to exacerbate that problem. Almost at 2 minutes. Okay.
Gloria's ruthless.
I know she is, and I respect that. And then finally, they're talking about whenever this nonsense that gets settled down there with the speakership and whatnot, a vote for term limits. Where do you stand? I believe after just seeing a great senator, Feinstein, be how many, what, dying in Congress? We've got to look at something. And you were talking about mental incompetence. I mean, there was a number of them there, and it looked horrible for her. I don't know how to say it any better. I mean.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And I'm thrilled that your spouse is healed. Like we're not quite out of the woods, but we're on the journey to 5 years of Mary being cancer-free. And by the way, yeah. Innovation. A lot of women would be dead of breast cancer 30 years ago that they survived today because of remarkable innovation. Okay. First of all, don't give up on bipartisanship. I started this meeting with 4 bipartisan bills: Infrastructure, PAC Act, Safe Communities Act, because it's not dead. It just doesn't make the headlines. There's no fun talking about it on MSNBC or Fox News when you do stuff in bipartisan fashion. You know what's fun? Matt Gaetz or whatever Ilhan Omar inadvisedly says somewhere. That's the fun stuff. So don't give up on bipartisanship. Even as we are as polarized as we are, don't give up on it. The truth is that most American sentiments are in the middle, somewhere, left or right, but in the middle. And as long as that is true, and as long as we vote and express ourselves, I'm not losing hope. On the debt and the deficit, which this has now come up a few times, I have, to some extent, reluctantly arrived at the conclusion that the legislature is not going to fix this without a really aggressive external signal. Markets saying, guys, we've been saying it's unsustainable for a long time, now it's really unsustainable. And the service of that wasn't helped when yes, it was $10 trillion when I joined the Congress. And at the time, the National Security Advisor said the biggest strategic threat to the United States, this was when the debt was 30% of what it is today, is our debt and deficit. I believed it. And as a result, I went to work with the Simpson-Bowles Commission. Some of you will remember that. It was a commission made up of Democrats and Republicans that actually, for the first time ever, came up with a balanced and enormously difficult proposal that has all the stuff that all of us hate, but that will be part of a fair deal. Their principle was, we're going to protect the most vulnerable in this country. We're not going to ask those who have nothing to give very little of, to give what little they have, and that we're going to do it in a balanced way. And so they came up with a plan that involved, yes, some tax increases, some revenue increases. My colleagues sometimes say we need to raise the tax rates. There is so much work we can do taking gunk out of the tax code that benefits the very wealthiest people in this country, that before you go to raising rates, you should think seriously about that stuff. There was just an article in the New York Times about a New York magnate who did a like-kind exchange over a piece of art. In other words, this individual bought a piece of art. It grew dramatically in value. Instead of paying capital gains tax on that very happy thing, there is a like-kind exchange that allows you to not pay tax. Anyway, I could go on at some length. So Simpson-Bowles had some revenue increases, and it had some tough medicine. It had reforms of Medicare and Social Security, consistent with not harming the most vulnerable. It was pretty aggressive on the nature of our defense spending, which is never popular to discuss. And when I voted for the Simpson Bowles budget on the floor, I joined precisely 32 other members of a 435 bodies in voting yes on that. And I still hear about it. By the way, I still hear about it from both sides. So my point is that I sadly believe that it's going to take some sort of signal, and it may happen because of higher interest rates, to finally get the Congress to say we've got to make some tough choices. And I'll take some blame for that. I asked President Obama to keep building the F-22 about a decade ago. To this day, I feel conflicted about it because the F-22, until it shot down the Chinese balloon, it had never seen combat. It's a true story. But anyway, they were moving on to the F-35, and the F-22 was fabulously expensive. President Obama said, we don't want it. The Air Force said, we don't want it, and fabulously expensive. And Himes writes a letter saying, keep building the F-22. Why? Because we build F-22 engines in the state of Connecticut. So I'm not asking for your absolution on that. I'm just saying you understand the forces that cause people like me to do what we do. Okay. Sure.
Too many starts.
Congressman Himes, my name is Ben Wesley. I'm a longtime resident of Norwalk. I'm here to advocate for the immediate end of war funding and an immediate effort to begin negotiations with the Russian Republic. I do that for a number of reasons, but mainly because many of you who saw me outside might not have been able to make out the poster, but it had a poster of an 800 kiloton nuclear weapon exploding in New York City, and what that would do for Greenwich, and what that would do to Norwalk. Those of you in Greenwich would have about 15 minutes before you would get enough nuclear poisoning that you would die. And similarly in Norwalk, we'd have about 20 minutes before you could expect to have enough poisoning that you would die. Obviously, if you looked at the blast, you'd be blinded. And obviously, it's a number of other horrible things that would happen to you. So the risk is real. I follow your Facebook feed significantly. I see you advocating for more airplanes. Obviously, we just sent cluster bombs, all the nuclear-covered armament. Those are all things that were considered war crimes. So I think it's time to look inside and say, are we advocating, are we doing things that are consistent with a war hawk? And although I've agreed with you in the past, you've advocated for staying in Niger. Even though we're laughing at Matt Gaetz, he wanted us to get out of the state of Niger. He advocated for staying in Syria, even though Matt Gaetz asked us to get out of Syria. And lastly, I would just say, what are you doing personally to advocate for peace? That's my question.
Thank you. Thank you, and I really mean that. We are sometimes a warlike people, and we need voices. We need Quaker voices, even if I don't agree with them always. We need voices of pacifism making the very clear moral argument against war, even if we disagree. The way I've handled my decisions is on a case-by-case basis. You heard what I said about China. I'm spending a lot of time, and I brought it up unprompted, spending a lot of time getting my colleagues, the American public, and others to just take a step back on China. Deep breath. Talked about those 2 aircraft carriers. China also, like Russia, is a nuclear power. So I regard that as an important act I do to try to reduce the probability we find ourselves in conflict in China. I haven't advocated one way or the other on Niger. I opposed. Okay. Okay. There were about 150 amendments, so you may very well be right on that, and I may have forgotten. We have a counterterrorism mission in the region, which I have been supportive of. When Barack Obama asked the Congress for authorization to do what he called surgical strikes in Syria. This was after Assad had gassed his own people, and there was a pretty compelling argument to go after Assad. And President Obama had unwisely drawn a red line and said if he did that, there would be military consequences. I had a couple town hall meetings about that because it was a war decision. And I ultimately told President Obama that I would not support his request to make strikes in Syria. You've heard me be pretty hawkish on Ukraine for reasons that I've explained. So I guess what I'm trying to tell you is two things. Number one, thank you for articulating the case for peace. It always needs to be made. I will defer to it unless there is, in my mind, as there is in Ukraine today, a powerful argument for stopping something that I regard as fairly evil. But thank you for your views.
Hello, my name is Frank Poslesny. I'm from Coscob, Connecticut. I'd like to address the fact that in a lot of states and in Connecticut, marijuana has been decriminalized and legalized. But I think there's been one major oversight. I'm 71 years old, so I lived through being a hippie and understanding, as a lot of people do, what it was like with over-policing, aggressive policing, and very harsh sentencing for minor offenses of marijuana in the 60s and 70s. Now, a lot of those people are still carrying those sentences and the repercussions and the impact of that. But I don't see any mechanism for helping those people to undo the harm that was done to them through the aggressive sentencing and over-policing and charging for minor offenses. So I'd really like to see the state of Connecticut make an example, because I've heard of no state taking any step to help all those people that have been effective victims of the old policies now that the policies have changed. And secondly, though I'm pleased with the policy, I'm also very concerned as I walk around the community. I'm from Coscob, and I walk through the parks of Stamford. I'm constantly aware of smelling pot by cars and people in cars going by, and I'm concerned, that I want it to be legalized, but I don't want a bunch of drunks and stoned people driving around my communities that can threaten me with their vehicle. So I'd like to know what can be done on both of those sides of this problem.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to be a little quick in my answer. It's a really interesting topic, but at the federal level, the decision to decriminalize is a state decision. But let me say this: the way it impacts my life is that we've been working on what's known as the Safer Banking Bill, which would allow banks to bank the cannabis businesses. Today, they don't do it because marijuana remains a federally scheduled drug. So the theory behind this, which I have supported, is let the banks bank these businesses where states decide to make that decision. Otherwise, these businesses end up with $50,000 in cash at the end of the day, and that has its own public safety issues. With respect, two things on your larger point. I did watch Raphael Warnock in the Senate go to town on this issue. His brother was apparently arrested and sentenced to a fairly lengthy sentence associated with marijuana. And I watched him go to town because the SAFER Act right now is in the Senate. Prior to that, Cory Booker of Newark was arguing for precisely what you're doing, which is fine. Let's allow them to be banked, but let's set in place rules that require communities that created such disparate impact on Black Americans in particular to lean into assisting them. Here's where I get out of, and I don't put state reps on the spot at my town hall meetings, but Hector Arzano's here. There may be other state reps. My understanding is that in the state of Connecticut, there were measures taken to give an extra boost to those communities that had suffered as a result. I can't tell you what they are because I haven't paid super close attention, but I know that Connecticut took measures to make sure that minorities in particular could get a step up in starting these businesses to try to address the disparate impact over time. So I would just ask you to consult with your state legislators on what that looked like. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Jonah Rothwein. I'm a Weston resident. And we can all say from Weston, we're very thankful for the return of Murad and Vida Tabaz. I just wanted to get some insight of your involvement of their return to the United States.
Yeah, it's been a really emotional 14 hours because I had dinner last night in Weston with Murad and his wife, who was also in Tehran. Murad Tabaz was a Weston resident who was brutally and illegally taken hostage by the Iranians. He spent 6 years in Evin prison. And I hadn't seen him. I worked for 6 years with the senators and with the White House and all sorts of, with the Trump White House and the Biden White House, and finally he was released. And I say it was emotional 14 hours because I had dinner with him last night, and to see him reunited with his family, with his kids and his grandkids, it was one of those moments where he thought, what a good thing. And then I wake up this morning, and almost certainly with Iranian help, Hamas has launched a brutal attack on Israel. The way the deal was structured for the release of the 5 hostages, the money was sent. It was Korean oil money. They had bought Iranian oil. The money was in Korea. The United States allowed the money, $5 billion, $6 billion, to move into a bank in Qatar. The Iranians are allowed to present invoices for food, medicine, and agricultural goods to that bank, and they pay it out. Good. We get to see that. We get to stop it if it's abused. Money is fungible. So my argument only goes so far. And I wish I could tell you that I'm 100% thrilled with the way it was handled with Murad. I'm 90% thrilled because a man's tragedy was ended. And these things are always hard. The Obama administration, by the way, took a very, very hard line with negotiation for terrorists. And as a result, there's a video out there of Mr. Foley being decapitated by ISIS. So these are brutal decisions. But I do think I'm guided by the value of let's bring our people home.
Some had speculated that Murad's intentions in Iran originally were not nature conservation. What insight could you give on that?
That's not true. I know where our intelligence assets are, and he was not an intelligence asset. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm Kathy Gabler, a resident of Greenwich, and I'm back to Ukraine. Most of the arguments against aid to Ukraine sound like they're coming from a base of very little understanding of what's going on and what the strategic importance is. I'm talking about the MAGA right. And Tom Malinowski, whom I admire greatly, was on the Brian Lehrer show on WNYC, and he gave a very cogent explanation not only of our strategic interests there and the essential nature of them in the whole world order, but also the cost to the American taxpayers, which he put in perspective, which is really not great, in the way he explained it. And I just want to recommend that to people who are fuzzy on the facts and aren't following it very closely, because the comments like, did he vote for me, Walensky? No, and by the way, he also spoke about Senator Menendez and explained why it's such a serious offense because of the information on Egypt and his meddling in Egyptian affairs. On top of it wasn't only the acceptance of money and everything else, it was what he was doing, which was really against our interests.
Yep. Yeah, no, look, and we've talked about Ukraine. I want to be brief in my response because we have a line here. But look, there are good critical questions to ask about Ukraine aid. One of them is it being used without corruption? By and large, the answer to that question is yes. And yeah, Ukraine has a real corruption problem. I get to see the flows of our aid and our weaponry, and the moment it crosses the Polish border, it is on the battlefield being used. So it's not like there's crates of 155 howitzer ammunition sitting around in warehouses in Kyiv. But that's a legitimate question. There's often an argument made that, hey, we've got big problems here at home. That's true. The greatest country history has ever known can do more than one thing at once. And standing up for the Ukrainians, I would argue, is one of those things that we should do. But there are legitimate questions, including the more pacifist tone that the gentleman took. Yeah, something else is going on. I don't know. I can't quite explain it to you. I would not have thought, if you had told me there was going to be meaningful congressional opposition to Ukraine in the U.S. Congress, I would have said, Democratic progressives are expressing an anti-war view as they have traditionally done. It's actually not there. It's in the House Republican Conference. I don't quite understand that. And by the way, it's not all Republicans. It's about half of them now. 100 or so voted against. I'm not sure I get that, but that's where we are. Yeah.
My main thing was a recommendation of WNYC, which is great.
WNYC. Okay. Thank you.
Hi, your name, town, and 2 minutes.
Sure. Hi, my name is Tim DeJesu. I live in Stamford. I'm from Ridgefield originally. I have a, oh, I'm sorry. I have a 4-year-old son named Liam. 3 years ago, he was kidnapped by his mother and taken to Germany. I have his return orders to bring him home to the United States, but the Germans will not let me do that. I've been trying to engage with your office for help, and have been unsuccessful. I'm not asking you to commit either way. I'm just saying, will you or someone from your office hear me out to help bring my son home?
Yeah, thank you. I can't promise you, these cases can be very complicated, so I can't promise you, but I can absolutely promise you a hearing. That's Rebecca. She's an attorney. She works in my office. Rebecca, you're going to sit with Tim sometime this week, I hope. Thank you. Thanks. I'm sorry.
Your name, town, and 2 minutes, okay?
My name is Gila, and I live in Koskob. And in very early February of 2020, I had all the symptoms of what later became known as COVID-19. Back then, it still didn't have a name. My life partner had been in what later became called a hotspot. Early on, there were terms like hotspots, and he went to a Jewish gathering in New Rochelle that later was blamed, accused of being a hotspot. So I had all the symptoms, and for me, it was really an adventure. I fought it off with a lot of vitamin C, and anyone wanting more details can, vitamin D also, I can give more details. But I regard the so-called lockdown as a real atrocity. 3 friends of mine who are about my age or were my age in their mid to late 60s would have probably been alive today were it not that so many resources were diverted to fighting this virus, which is 99.7% survivable. The pretext for this atrocious lockdown was supposedly to keep hospitals from being overwhelmed. So my question is, I know there are laws limiting the numbers of doctors and hospital beds and so on and so forth, all kinds of certificate of need laws and so forth. What can we do to increase the number of doctors, increase the capacity of hospitals, increase the number of nurses, so next time when a real pandemic comes around that is not going to be 99% survivable, it's going to be maybe only 50% survivable. So let us increase medical capacity for next time a pandemic comes around, and hopefully we won't need the lockdown, which destroyed many lives and destroyed much of this economy. Thank you for your help in 2008 against the FAA, the infrastructure oligarchy. So now there's a new oligarchy of the heroes, and I hope we can do something about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. It's a big question. I do want to be clear about something. Because you said it's 99% survivable. We lost over 1 million Americans to COVID. So I'll listen to all sorts of points of view, but that's about as serious as it gets, and so we shouldn't minimize. And it wasn't. There were certain elements, there were certain parts of our population that were much more brutally attacked by COVID than healthy white guys. But anyway, the question is nonetheless a fair one, which is, what can we do to make sure we have the medical infrastructure we need? Which, by the way, set aside pandemics, this country is aging pretty rapidly, and so we need to continue to build out medical infrastructure. The answer to the question, there's a lot of answers to the question, but 2, let me highlight. We're working really hard with Medicare and with the healthcare community to do 2 things. 1, bring on more professionals, and to let them use telemedicine. There are a lot of exams and other things that can be done remotely. That's more comfortable, often for senior citizens. It's less scary, and it's safer because it's unsafe to sit in some waiting rooms with lots of sick people if you have comorbidities and that sort of thing. So additional healthcare professionals with telemedicine and pushing down treatment to the appropriate level. So there's lots of things that today under licensing rules only doctors can do, but that certified nurse practitioners and others are perfectly capable of doing. So we're doing a lot of work figuring out how we can push that down to the most optimal level. And I'll just make a pitch here. One of the ways we can be less burdensome on our healthcare system is if we just are all healthier. And I say that because I was talking in Trumbull about this. Ozempic may be the thing that helps us figure out Medicare, right? We have a crisis in this country with obesity. Obesity leads to type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes leads to dialysis. Some of you don't know this. The Medicare program provides health insurance to people over 65, or full pay for dialysis for any American who needs it. And as a consequence, Medicare is paying an immense amount, tens of billions of dollars every year for something that should be prevented. So I just hold that up by the way, the usual, don't smoke, get exercise. But, there's going to be innovations too that lift some of the burden on the healthcare system. Yes, sir.
Name, town, 2 minutes.
John Chu from Greenwich. My question is climate change and the debt is a problem. Have you given much thought to developing new nuclear technologies such as SMRs, small modular reactors that power a nuclear sub, for example?
Yeah, I'm going to lose some environmentalist friends in this room. I actually think that what I regard largely as a rational fear of nuclear power was just a huge generational mistake we started making back in the 70s.
It's the safest source of power in the world.
By any standard, it's the safest source.
Even with the accidents.
The catastrophic accidents that we've had, set aside the Soviet reactor, which had its own things, but 3 Mile Island and Fukushima, both of which were really scary. Compared to the number of people who die in coal mines every year. Anyway, and look, there's a debate to be had here. I don't want to tell you that I'm dispensing truth from the mountaintop. I've always been a supporter of nuclear power because I think it's ultimately cheap and clean. There's really cool work being done on modular nuclear reactors. I think it's a terrible mistake for Germany to shut down its nuclear fleet. And by the way, you know what they're doing now? Because German economic growth is not increasing. They're adding more coal plants because they shut down their nuclear fleet. So last thing I'll say, the one thing we do need to do on nuclear is we do need ultimately to come up with a way to handle the very dangerous waste. But we can do that. We can do that.
Oh, hi. My name's Amy Vitale. I'm from Stamford, Connecticut. I've talked to you before about healthcare. It was about 10 years ago. My husband and I both work for ourselves and pay a boatload of money for insurance that gives us practically nothing. And then it's very frustrating because I'd like, I'm still a decent distance from Medicare, so, there's nothing that I can do about that. And then the frustration I have this year is I discover that many of my doctors are being bought out by these investment firms that are buying up lots and lots of local doctors, and then the focus seems to have shifted from patient care to profit. And I had an appointment in 2022 for $199 that cost me $850 in 2023 with the same exact doctor, actually not a doctor, a PA, not a doctor. And when I tried to negotiate with them, they didn't want to hear it. It's all about profit. So are we a little scared that all of our doctors' offices are being bought up by these entities that really their sole thing is about profit and not about patient care?
That may be the applause line. I'm taking note that was the applause line of the night. Definitely bigger than the CHIPS Act. And I think it was because I don't think anyone is so affluent that they don't feel the absurdity of not just the amount that we are asked to pay, but the complexity of it. With people with good insurance, you realize you get this bill for, $10,000 and then, wait, we reduce it for you down to $700. And then if you negotiate, and so it's just a really, really rickety system. It's hard to know where to start on this issue, but to agree with you, I don't know a lot about the implications of these. I think there are private equity and other financial investors who are buying up practices. What I do know a little bit more about is that there's consolidation happening around hospitals. So hospitals are buying private practices. And the reason that's a concern from a cost standpoint is that to provide exactly the same service that if you are an outpatient environment at your doctor's, three-person doctor's shop, the hospital will charge you if same place, but the hospital owns it because of the quirks of the reimbursement system. The hospital can charge you twice what that doctor would have provided you the day before he or she sold the practice. So I'm hesitant to sort of get into more stuff on all the stuff we need to do to make our healthcare system better, including what we just talked about, having fewer really expensive bad outcomes. There's a lot of innovation being done around encouraging hospitals and areas to do what they call capitation, which is you get paid for the life that you the individual that you provide healthcare to. That flips the incentives. Now all of a sudden the entire healthcare system is profitable by keeping you healthy. So things like nutritional advice if you're going to have obesity problems. So there's a lot of innovative thinking around here, but honestly, the industry, which is 17% of our economy, is pretty resistant to change. But
This investment thing seems to be a change.
Yeah.
So that's why just, something to look into before everyone's bought up and then we can get no care.
Thank you. You've given me some homework, which is I realize that I don't understand enough what's happening with the private purchases of healthcare providers. I'll do some work on it. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Alex Patton. I'm a resident of Greenwich. So I have a couple questions. First of all, just how you feel about student debt forgiveness in the first place, and also obviously the economy could be doing better. Interest rates are still high, inflation's still very high. I'm curious on what economic policy you're the most passionate about and why you think it'll work.
Okay, on student debt, thanks for asking the question. I'll tell you, there's a big conversation to be had. I'll tell you where I am. I supported President Biden's plan to provide relief of $10,000 or $20,000 to people who made less. I can't remember the exact number. The Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional, so it doesn't really matter. But I supported the idea of providing relief to people under a certain income level of 10, 20,000. And, if this ever comes up again, if you have $200,000 in debt, should it be 30,000 instead of 10? Wide open. I don't support blanket student loan relief. And the reason for that is probably rooted in, my reversion to progressive values, which say that we ought to bestow our largesse on the people who really need it. And the truth is that all of those, not all, a lot of the people who are carrying student debt are also in the top third of the American income distribution. And we know that that's true because if you go to college, your earning power is much higher. So I don't support a blanket wiping out of student debt, but it's $1.6 trillion. And at the bottom of the income distribution, which is comprised of a lot of different kinds of people, a lot of the real brutal stuff is people who go to community college and they ultimately can't complete it because they've got kids and a job and they take on $30,000, $40,000 in debt and they never get a degree. That's a very bad place to be. That's where I would focus government largesse, as opposed to somebody who, has the earning power to ultimately pay back their debt. So that's how I think about that issue. Your second one, that was a broad question. What economic policies do I support? So I've said it a couple of times. We have the traditional political arguments. How much regulation do we want? How much does regulation impact the economy? The left tends to want more regulation. Let's set that aside. Here's the number one thing, and I said it before. The number one thing that I personally get excited about is making sure that places outside of Palo Alto and Boston and Austin have the opportunity to grow new businesses and to innovate. The real wealth producers in this country are the new companies that we start from zero that become trillion-dollar. Some of these trillion-dollar behemoths get problematic over time, but the most valuable companies in America, most of them didn't exist 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Google, Facebook, and let's set aside all the problems with online. But you get my point here, which is that we should be doing everything we can to make sure that we have a lot more innovation right here. That we could talk about lots of stuff, but that if you said one, that would be my area of real focus.
Name, town, and 2 minutes, please.
Dixon McIntyre from Darien, Connecticut. Key question I wanted to ask you is about I-95 and Metro North. I asked you this same question 2 years ago when you were at your Westport Town Hall. In 1975, my dad used to commute from Darien to Grand Central. It took him 45 minutes. Today, it takes an hour and 5 minutes. Governor Lamont has proposed reducing Metro North service, increasing fares, and yet, when you look at I-95, which took me close to a half hour to get here today from Darien, it's out of control. What have you proposed? What have you done? What are you, Richard, and Ned, as you said 2 years ago, are all working closely together on this to solve the problem? I see no progress.
Yeah. Part of the reason you see no progress is that this is not a problem that gets solved really quickly. So, I mean, I'll give you one example. One of the biggest bottlenecks, and then I'll answer your broader question. One of the biggest bottlenecks on the most important rail artery in the country, Boston to New York, was Norwalk's Walk Bridge. It was 110 years old, kept failing. It's all made out of iron, and it would get hot, and the iron would expand, and you'd have to send guys out there. Meanwhile, Amtrak and Metro North can't go through Norwalk. We're rebuilding that bridge. It's a massively expensive rebuild, but the bipartisan, anyway, there is progress. It's not instantly visible. 95 is just a plain hard problem, and you pretty quickly get out of my area of expertise. There's proposals to widen it, which engineers say are not good long-term proposals. To me, it feels like the answer is getting people off the highways. And yes, that's train and mass transit. I take the train to DC pretty much every week. It's also being innovative around things like work from home, which I know a lot of Americans are experimenting with today. And I get your frustration. I live here too. But I really am proud of the $550 billion that is being made available to the country to begin to address these problems. So I wish I could tell you that. And by the way, some of this stuff is pretty nitty gritty. One of the big challenges on Metro North is a lot of towns don't have enough parking. So it doesn't matter how good the train service is if you can't park in the parking lot. So this stuff gets kind of nitty gritty. Now you're having a local conversation about, do we want tiered parking? No, we don't want tiered parking. So my point is, the resources are there, the progress is there, if not immediately visible, and you can, I'm going to keep working on it. It's the number one issue that my constituents raise.
One brief solution, which I at least see in the Boston area, on Route 128, during key congestion hours, they use the emergency lane for 2 or 3 hours. Why do we not consider something like that for I-95?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer to it. But if you give me your, this is a sort of Condot question, but if you leave me your contacts, we'll get you an answer. It's also a little political. We had fortunately I didn't have to participate in it, but we had a long and angry conversation about tolling in southwestern Connecticut. I'm going to leave that one there. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name's Jonathan Alloy. I'm not a member of a political party. I'm a Democrat. So,
organized political party.
An organized political party, right. So, like probably many people in your district, I live in Westport. I'm getting active texts right now from Americans in Israel, in Ukraine, and in other American states who are under active threat from bullies and extremists, whether those are Hamas terrorists or Russian invaders or Republicans. And I want you to know, I don't want you to compromise with the people who are attacking democracy and attacking women's rights. I want you to stand up and fight for those things. And the question I have for you is that right now, the two leading candidates for Speaker of the House of Representatives, one of the 3 constitutional officers, is a guy who describes himself as David Duke without the baggage. Steve Scalise is a noted racist. And a guy who covered up child sex abuse, Jim Jordan. So when we talk about bipartisanship, what are you doing as a member of the House Democratic Conference to get Republican moderates to support Hakeem Jeffries as Speaker?
That's not going to happen. I mean, it's just look. I could say a lot of words. That's just not going to happen. And now, 3 weeks from now, if we haven't elected a speaker and we're really reaching into we're already on, we've never had a speaker deposed, so we're sort of on uncharted ground. Certainly not going to happen in the next 2 weeks. But just as I texted two Republican chairmen and said there's a deal to be done, I would be interested in that when it's not completely fanciful. And look, I will take a backseat to no one in fighting for women's reproductive rights. And I don't think I need to justify that. You can look up my voting score, et cetera. And, I can't visit Russia because I'm sanctioned by the Russian government. And I'm not beloved of the former president's supporters because I spent an awful lot of time not saying Republicans are bad, but saying this is a threat to our democracy. I'm not going to say that Republicans are bad. I'm looking at a very good friend who is a Republican and a very decent Republican. And the reason I'm not going to do that, even though it breaks my heart to see the statistic that 60% of registered Republicans in this country believe that the last election was stolen. January 6th was a very emotional moment for me. I'm not going to say that because that doesn't help anybody. It does not help this country. And I work with Republicans every day, and it breaks my heart that they're not more vocal about what Trump's statements represent to our democracy. But I'm also very aware of the fact, by the way, and again, I'm taking a backseat to nobody on a lot of these issues, but our system is, the software of our system is compromised. It is. We have a Senate where you can't do anything without 60 votes. I wish we didn't, but we do. We have a very narrow majority where everything, the 4 bills that I just talked about, all of which I supported, were bipartisan. So I'm not going there to say that compromise is wrong or to say that I would put Republicans, which I assuredly will not do, in the same category as Putin or Hamas.
I will. Republicans are bad. When you have 9 people who sit down with one Nazi, you have a table of 10 Nazis. When you have Republicans who you're saying, and I'm not elected, so I can be partisan, but when you have a group of people who you're saying are good people and they're voting for bad things and supporting bad things, they are bad, and you got to call them out on it.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate even if I disagree with the intensity of it, believe me, I understand what you're saying. Okay. Yes, sir.
Hi. I'm Ern Shermer, state of Connecticut resident since late 1996. So I have 2 points. The first point, first of all, thank you. I'll take your wife first. To your wife, your family, and you for coming here and speaking to us. Here is my ask. It's a Saturday afternoon, it's family time, but please come back 2-3 times in 2024 because social media, press, and all that stuff, seeing you live in person and interacting with you is very different and extremely helpful. So to your wife, please. Please allow him to come back, right? And I will bicycle with you over from Coscop, right? Here's my serious question. Our planet, Switzerland lost 10% of all its snowfields and glacial surface in the last 2 summers alone. Where does the water go? Particularly, we need a federal and we need a more urgent type of plan and real action. Rising ocean water levels. We can build walls in Connecticut because we have a bit more money than some other states, but then the water will end up going to Maine or somewhere else. So we need a national solution and we need it urgently. What is happening? What can we do to help along? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me be quick because I see we've got 5 or 6 people and really 5 minutes left on the schedule. So we've talked about climate change a bunch, and we should talk about it more. Let me say a couple things that haven't been said before. If we were really serious, had we been serious 10 years ago or 15 years ago about addressing climate change, here's where it gets a little technical. We would have correctly priced the use of carbon. And the economists in the room understand what the concept, everybody understands in this room, what an externality is. When you buy a gallon of gasoline for $4, that's not the full cost of using the gasoline. The cost is borne by the climate. And so one of the ways to do that, which I would support if it were ever to come for a vote, is a fully refundable carbon tax. So the theory there is if you just add a little bit of cost to the use of carbon, but then you give that revenue back, and in order to get it through, it's not going to happen anytime soon, but in order to get it through the Congress, you'd have to give all the money back, so it's not used to grow the government. What you've done is you've basically rebalanced the cost of using carbon versus the cost of using other sources of energy. I wish that that had been the way we addressed that, because that would have changed the structure as opposed to providing subsidies and tax credits for electric vehicles, which is a much less efficient way of doing that. So it doesn't do much good to say, I wish we'd done that, but that, if we were really serious about it, is the way we would have done that. And maybe we still will as people start to see increasingly the costs of climate change. But your question was, I forgot where the gentleman went. Your question is, what can you do? Look, we all have a role here to play. We all have a role here to play. My daughters are constantly on me about, when I yell at them for shutting down the, turning off the lights and not ready, we all have a role. And they say, well, we don't need to turn off the lights because you're not doing anything in Washington. That's not the way to think about it. Seriously, I had that argument. So you get my point. There's a lot that we can do individually that may not make a massive difference, but that could make a difference.
Okay, your name, town, and...
Hi, my name is Cynthia Colson. Hi, Jim.
Great to see you.
And I'm from Riverside. You already answered or addressed my first question, which had to do with the budget deficit. So I'm going to go a bit personal. And I just wondered if you'd like to share the frustrations of the office. What do you find most distasteful, frustrating, et cetera? And if you have anything to say about what keeps you going, and I hope it keeps you going for a long time. Love to hear that. Okay.
Thank you, Cynthia. It's wonderful to see you. Sure, let me answer that quickly. First of all, even in tough times, I'm very aware that this is an enormous privilege. And I really mean that. And I don't just mean that because it's a privilege to be a member of Congress, but to represent this district, which is a very educated, thoughtful, moderate district. We're now into Town Hall number 2, where people have been immensely respectful of each other, and that just warms my heart. The things that I don't like are, and maybe you've sensed this from my Defense of Republicans just launched. There's two things I don't like about the job. One is ignorance, and nobody has a monopoly on ignorance. But when somebody says, the debt and the deficit are impossible, $33 trillion, you got to cut that foreign aid. That's ignorance. I mean, I don't mean to be a jerk about it, but foreign aid is less than 1% of our overall budget. And that's why I said, let's have the deficit conversation, but let's have a smart one. So, when my colleagues, and I'm not exempt from this, I'm not saying I'm exempt from ignorance, but when my colleagues sort of, focus on stuff that just doesn't make sense, it feels to me like a wasted time. Or when we have these conversations, which thankfully we have not had today, but in ways that personalize and create, instead of Republicans versus Democrats, conservatives versus liberals, however you want to frame it, become true Americans versus traitors, good versus evil. Again, our system, compromise, nobody ever got a statue for compromising, but understand our system. It's the only way it works. And it's not hard to compromise with the right wing if they're acting in good faith and we strike a deal. That's how we kept the government open. It is really hard to compromise with somebody who sees you as evil. And that's where our civic conversation has gone. And that makes me sad.
So this is maybe a little bit more of a boring question, so I apologize. But to my knowledge, the last time Congress looked at copyright was in '98, when some of us weren't even born yet. And that was the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which had some good ideas, but also largely failed to predict what the digital millennium actually looked like. And so copyright law doesn't have really good solutions for all of the small independent artists who are selling their work over the internet and can't afford lawyers. And it definitely has no answers for the question of what can you and can't you do with generative AI, which has suddenly come out of the woodwork. So I'm wondering if there are plans in Congress to kind of readdress copyright as a topic and actually address how it's been affected by the technological revolutions recently.
That little bit I just gave about ignorance. I would love, and I do this every once in a while, I would love to sit down with you and understand better, because candidly, copyright law is not something that I am up on right now. I know the answer to your question, which is, has the Congress made good faith efforts lately to try to address copyright law? The answer to that question is no, it hasn't. But I would love to hear more from you on that topic. By the way, you said it exactly right. All of a sudden, I've been spending a lot of time trying to understand AI. All of a sudden now, this issue has popped up in a really interesting way. You know, if generative AI entirely relies on information that is absorbed from other places, which it does, what rights do the people who provided that information, whether it's a painting or an image or photography? That's a super interesting question. So I wish I had a better answer for you, but I'd love to sit down with you and learn more. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Susan Stern from Greenwich, Connecticut. I'd like to thank you, first of all, for your very early and unequivocal support for Israel and your condemnation of Hamas's terrorism there. It's been an awful situation there, and there are people who are now hostages, maybe used as human shields going forward. I have to apologize because I had car trouble and came a little late, so if you've heard this question, just ask me to sit down. But I'm wondering if you are familiar with the National Strategy to Counter Anti-Semitism, and if you can tell us a little bit about how you think Congress might deal with some of the recommendations in that report.
Yeah. So a number of groups, ADL and others, have been very active, and AJC, ADL have been very active in not just condemning anti-Semitism, but saying here's measures that we can take. And a lot of those measures are, I think, being well adopted by the Congress, whether it's the definition of anti-Semitism at the State Department or the provision of additional security monies for faith institutions, largely synagogues, that can use that federal money to protect them. So, you know, I'm happy to say that this is one area that doesn't actually get caught up in the thresher of partisan politics. There is a very strong bipartisan consensus. I can't address every point in that strategy, but there's a very strong bipartisan understanding that anti-Semitism has reared its head in a way that we haven't seen in a very long time, and that we need to, at every level, locally, state, federal, families, houses of faith, address it in a meaningful way.
Hatreds of all sorts are rising, which is terrible, but the Jewish community has suffered disproportionately compared to other religions. We suffer almost, I think, 60% of all the hate crimes that are based on religion are against Jews, and we're only about 2% of the people in the United States. So I appreciate your efforts on our behalf, and thank you for continuing communication and conversations with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, hi, my name is Terry, and I'm a Greenwich resident. And I want to ask you about something that I really don't hear a lot about, so I don't know is it a conspiracy theory or not, is foreign countries buying American farmland. Yes. Which to me is a huge security issue. I mean, I haven't researched it a lot, so I didn't want to put a name to it, but if you could comment on that.
Yeah, it's not a conspiracy theory. And water. Didn't hear about water. Okay. It is not a conspiracy theory, and it's candidly, I know a little bit about it, not a lot. I have colleagues who represent agricultural areas who know a lot about it, including colleagues that sit with me on the Intelligence Committee. I would say two things about it. Number one, in the last time that we reformed a law called CFIUS, which is the law that gives us the right to essentially stop transactions that could be used to, basically provide weaponry or national security assets to our adversaries. The last time we updated it to include the ability to stop transactions around land generally that are surrounding things like military bases or intelligence facilities and that sort of thing. So we took a little step in that direction. In terms of the purchase of farmland, as I understand it, and I need to do a little bit more work here. I'm not huge on farmland issues because I just don't have a lot in Connecticut's 4th District. But there is, I think, a worry both about the strategic issue. In other words, is farmland being bought because it is within radio range of a missile silo, which happens in the Midwest? Or is it being bought because a Chinese agricultural company is buying a commercial asset and they just want to grow corn? Those are two very different things. People will have different opinions on it, but I'll just stop this by saying, since I'm sort of out of the knowledge that I have on the topic, which is that there are a lot of agricultural members who are thinking and working on that right now in the Congress. Thank you.
Michael Friedman from Stamford. Jim, my congressman, I've been waiting months and months and months. I've been preparing for this moment to meet you. You've met my sister 3 times in Westport, okay. Jim, this is very serious. I've called your office. I've called Chris Murphy, Dick Blumenthal, Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, the DNC, the White House Communications Office, because you Democrats, 2 minutes, that's all I'm gonna take, and I'll ask you please for 5 more later after this or on the phone. Jim, you Democrats, right on up to President Biden, have a powerful rhetorical, this is not a question, it's a comment to help you, a messaging rhetorical tool that you're not using. 3 words. 3 words. Pro-life hypocrisy. I want to hear you, Jim, please, and every major Democrat, talk to your communications department, right on up to President Biden, start calling out the Republicans for calling themselves pro-life when they are not. They will not lift a finger to ban semi-automatic military-style automatic assault weapons that are tearing up the bodies of our little children in our elementary schools. Those bullets tear up their bodies. They do the same to adults. I'm coming up on 2 minutes. Culture of life. You're the party of culture of life because you want to ban semi-automatic assault weapons. I want to hear you and all Democrats on TV, in the well, and everywhere in debates say you Republicans, you're pro-birth, maybe you're pro-fetus, but you're not pro-life. We're pro-life. You're not pro-life because out of what, last words, Nancy Mace a few weeks ago on MSNBC, out of one side of her mouth, we're pro-life, 6-week ban, yes, we want to protect life. Out of the other side of her mouth, will you ban semi-automatic assault weapons? No, that's not pro-life, Jim, and you guys are not using that rhetorical messaging, this is about messaging, tool that kind of brings together the abortion rights for women and banning, not all guns, talk to legal law-abiding gun owners. We're talking to you. We're not coming for your guns, but we're going to ban semi-automatic assault weapons. That's pro-life. The Democrats, we are pro-life. You're not. You're hypocrites.
I did not have Democratic congressman does town hall meeting and most aggressive criticism comes from Democrat on my bingo card today. But I appreciate, I appreciate that.
It's powerful.
Yeah.
Let me drive the Republicans crazy if you call yourselves pro-life and say they're not pro-life.
I want to tell you a story. Thank you for that advice. I do want to tell you a story. Quick story. It's a great place to end because it peels away some of the challenges that we have that generates that kind of passion, apart from the violence that we uniquely have in this country around gun violence. So about 3 years ago, I go to Sacred Heart University where there is a veterans community room. There's 24 veterans at Sacred Heart, and isn't this cool? Veterans at Sacred Heart, they have their own community room. So I make an appointment and I go see what I thought was going to be 12 veterans. These are young guys, a couple of women, a couple of Marines that have been in Afghanistan, a couple Army guys. Anyway, I show up and there's one guy there, Marine. He's probably 23 years old. He's using the GI Bill to get educated at Sacred Heart. I said, "Where is everybody?" He said, "I didn't want to talk to you because you're a gun grabber." And I said, "Really?" And he was there, and he was a Marine. He'd been an infantry guy. This is a serious guy. And I said, let's have a conversation about that. And so we sat down, we had this conversation. I said, "So gun grabber. So let me tell you where I am. First of all, I swear an oath to support, uphold, and defend the Constitution of the United States. The Second Amendment is part of the Constitution. So I don't sort of start out in a bad place, but here's what I think. I think we should have universal background check. 90% of Americans want it. I think we should have that. I do think, I can't tell you exactly what they look like, but I can tell you that there are weapons of war that, should not be in civilian hands, and the Marine is saying that's darn right. And, you know, I had 2 or 3 other things. And this Marine listens to me. He's a combat-hardened infantry guy, and he says, yeah, and you know what else? When I was in the Corps, I had to requalify on all of my weapons every year. Civilians should have to requalify on their weapons every year. And I said, oh my God. If I said that, I'd be run out of town on a rail. And the reason I tell you that story is that, that issue in particular is an issue where if we actually have the honest conversation, and by the way, the NRA is absolutely not interested in people having that honest conversation because you discover that there's immense amounts of common ground. But if we actually have that conversation, we're not that. There are those who would revoke the Second Amendment. There are those who think that that amendment is absolute. But pretty much everybody else agrees on a lot of that stuff. And I'm going to end there and just say a big thank you to all of you for being here. I can't do my job without hearing from you, and I'm just so proud of this dialogue. Thank you, everybody.